the other side, particularly for injured workers who've lost limbs, they will come and ask the company, say, well, could I have an artificial limb, please? Could you either pay for one or manufacture one in your workshops? And again, some of the railway companies, the bigger railway companies, had workshops within their railway factories that were dedicated to making artificial limbs.
Hello, I'm Natalie from Genealogy Stories, and welcome to Twice Removed, the show where we talk about everything history related. I'd like to welcome my guest today, Mike Esbester from the University of Portsmouth, co-lead on the Railway Work, Life and Death project, which he's so kindly put behind you so that I could just read it without messing up my lines there. Hi Mike, how are you today?
Hi Natalie, I'm fine, thanks. And yourself?
I'm good, thank you. Excited to ask you all about railways.
Well, it's great to be here, and I'm, hopefully we'll share some of the excitement.
Brilliant. Okay, so can you tell me when railways first started being used in the UK, sort of in earnest, when they were kind of considered established and people were using them every day?
Sure. So there are all sorts of milestones that people, and particularly railway historians, look at in terms of what we now understand as railways. So mainline railways with steam traction and later diesel and electric traction. So 1825, so we're coming up for a big centenary, or the bicentenary of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. But really, the 1830s is when it all starts kicking off, and you get huge railway building that's done by private companies. So you end up with kind of higgledy-piggledy lines going hither and thither, lots of different companies serving the same sort of place. There's competition, and again, then increasing use as you get deeper into the 1830s and really the 1840s. When it starts to become, if not commonplace, then there are lots and lots of people using the railways for both sending goods, but also for passenger travel as well.
Okay, so that's sort of when they're beginning to use it for, commuting to work, for example.
Yeah, I think the 1840s are a really key phase in this. By that time, you've got enough of the system connected, and you can get more places that it does become possible to travel further. And as you say, then there's a kind of regularity of services, particularly into the major urban areas. So Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, London, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Cardiff, the big locations that are being urbanised, industrialised.
Okay. And what kind of effect did that have upon the labour market in terms of you've got this new technology that obviously requires a lot of workers to run and maintain and create new lines, and so what kind of effect did that have?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of the classic thing that people think about is a shift into urban spaces. Obviously, not just the railways. You've got to have jobs to go to, so they're a facilitator in that, and the impact that has on the agricultural labour market. Which, there is definitely an impact there. I think perhaps people overstate it at times. There's this kind of great idea about the Industrial Revolution, which we might question anyway, but that it suddenly sees a kind of mass change. You suddenly shift from basically agricultural work to urban work, and that really isn't the case. The agricultural professions continue for a very long time. Is a key part of the labour market for some time. So the railways definitely have an impact, and in terms of facilitating other forms of work, but also in terms of the railways themselves, they're a big employer. They become one of the UK's largest employers of people, men and women. People tend to think about the men more so than the women, but women were employed on the railways from the outset in various capacities. So there's an impact. Hard to quantify, but there's definitely an impact.
Okay. Oh, so what kind of jobs were there on the railway? Can you give some idea of the range of jobs?
Absolutely. Well, fairly much everything. It seems the railways were, again, really interesting kind of companies, because the bigger companies certainly did pretty much everything themselves. So they would make fairly much anything that they used, and it would all be branded. So right from the pencils up to the engines and the carriages and the stations and the kind of the big things that we see. And you need people to do that. So you need people to make the stuff. So you have people working in iron foundries that the railway companies build. So Swindon, for example, would be a classic example. of a new location that comes about, or kind of, it was already there but really small, and then a huge expansion because of the Great Western Railway. And we see others like that. Crewe would be another example with the London North Western Railway. So these big works that are producing everything. But then you need people to operate it. So you need the people who are laying the tracks, maintaining the tracks. You need people who are driving the engines. You need the guards on the trains, whether passenger or goods trains. You need staff at the stations. You've got hotels in due course. As time goes on, you get the railways they're big operators of horse and carts, because you need to get goods, particularly to or from the station. So yeah, there's all sorts going on, and into the 20th century, you get motor transport, you get shipping concerns. In the 1930s, they start getting their hand in with air traffic as well. So fairly much everything. It's really quite unusual ways. But
yeah, that's a huge variation of jobs when you think about it. Right, the toddler is kicking off already, so I am going to get Dad to pull her out. So I'll just pause a second. No, that is when you think about it like that, that is a huge variation of jobs that you could have. And did pay conditions, the roles, did they vary across the different private companies? Was there sort of competition there?
Yeah, so there was some labour market competition within the railway companies. Again, one of the other kind of slightly tangential is that you start to get people moving overseas as well, taking their railway knowledge and experience, particularly to places like South America, where the railways are being constructed later. So, and the expertise and skills are well sought after. Often at a higher level, kind of more managerial sorts of roles, but actually, the construction work and knowing how to drive a steam engine as well. So you get this kind of really interesting mobility of people, both internally and over national boundaries as well.
It's interesting how some of those roles have kind of gone into kind of like a cultural history. I was just thinking, as you were talking about navvies. So I remember my mum, when I was a child, if I was sort of eating whilst walking around, she'd either say, "You're not in the army," or she'd say, "You're not a navvy." So sit down. And it just occurred to me that somebody listening might not know what a navvy is. Could you explain what a navvy is?
Yeah, sure. So these are the navigators, shortened to navvies, they were employed initially to build the canals, so navigations again, and then when we'd shifted from canal building into railway building, they had the right skills. The right skills being basically hard work, because it was a hard life, and again, some were exposed to quite terrible dangers, often on minimal pay. And again, there's large groups of people, but again, there's an interesting kind of transnational migration, although it wasn't transnational at that point, in terms of you get a lot of navvies being Irish. So again, kind of it's the sort of labour that unfortunately that was deemed suitable at this time, so 1830s, 1840s, what was available as well, and people willing to do it on relatively low wages because there wasn't much else going on, both in Ireland or in Britain. So for them,
yeah, it's just a hard slog, was it? I mean, you're literally carving out the countryside, to lay track.
Absolutely.
So I always think that when you see a rail line go through a really steep hill, or through a tunnel, I always think, I wonder whether this is an old line, and if so, it would have been built by hand. That's incredible, really.
Yeah, it's the tunnels always that you just think that's. I mean, they're less visible in some respects, obviously, because they're underground. But you've got to get through the rock to do that. Whereas, with the cuttings, the embankments, again, they're more visible in some respects because they are these great heaps of earth, or the dips that again have by and large been shifted by hand, which is incredible effort and obviously very labour intensive.
Yeah, am I right in thinking? So I'm going back to my A-level history day, so it's a long time ago. Am I right in thinking that it was the railways that ended up bringing in a shift in being paid weekly to being paid monthly? So I remember being told that people who were being paid weekly, and I don't know, this is just an urban myth, that people that were being paid weekly were drinking their wages and therefore missing days of work because they they were drunk. So they shifted it to monthly so that they'd lose less days of people being hungover.
Well, that's interesting. So again, this kind of ties in more. I don't know about that exactly, and I'll come back to the railway element of that one in a moment. But yeah, I mean, there was concern about St. Monday being the day off because of the drinking on the weekend, or on the Sunday because the weekend still included Saturdays as a work day at that point. But again, yes, there is certainly some thought that it's tied in with industrialisation and a kind of more disciplined use of time. As to railways and weekly versus monthly, again, it depends rather on what role. Thinking about the wages then, monthly versus weekly, it depends a bit on the role. Some people still paid daily on the railways, again, labouring type jobs, at casual labouring. But yeah, weekly wages for the more manual grades, and then monthly for the more kind of middle ranking and upwards managerial wages, so kind of salaried wages. So again, there's always sort of neat class differentials, both between working classes and middle classes, but also within class boundaries as well, that some deemed important.
Okay, and other pop history fact. Was it railways that brought about the introduction of a standardised system of time, Greenwich Mean Time?
Oh, fun! Yeah, okay, brilliant. Just last night was a friend in Canada invited me in to talk to his class about some work that I've done on exactly this, and it was lovely. They're a great class, and that came up because yes, this is it. When you've got when you're covering large distances, and this is in kind of UK terms, obviously last night, a caveat, that Canadian terms, these are not large distances, but in the UK terms, large distances, say from London to Penzance, or London up to Birmingham, or again, it's the east-west differences that are important. When you're doing that by coach, and it takes days to make a journey, 5 minutes here and there, 10 minutes is less important. When you're doing it in a much shorter period, a number of hours, then actually the time difference is important, particularly for safety reasons. So you don't want to be, again, in the 1830s, 1840s, when we've got early versions of how trains were controlled on the tracks, you don't want to be setting one off at one location at one time, and then off at another location the other time, finding meet in the middle. So yeah, the standardization of time, you start seeing it in the 1830s, but really 1840s. I forget when. I think it's it's either 1860s or 1880s that we get genuine, fully standardized time. But it's a kind of operational demand, effectively, from the railways.
And what sort of speed, talking about time, what sort of speed were the trains travelling at in the 1840s then? Were they fast?
Well, yeah. Well, okay, I was going to say it depends which train you catch, and it did, yeah. Which is a slightly less silly comment than it may seem, because obviously you might think, well, an express train's going to be quicker than a slow train, or what was called a stopping train that stopped at every station. Well, yes, it was, but there's even one that's slower than that, effectively. I'll come back to that. Everything's going to look fast compared to horse travel, or coach travel, or canal travel. So, yes, obviously there are people have concerns in the 1830s about the kind of the dangers of travelling at railway sorts of speeds. And we're talking, 12 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour, things that nowadays obviously wouldn't seem that dramatic to us, because of course we're so used to it. And with changes, technology, particularly the motor car, these are just kind of everyday sorts of things. At the time, they would really have been quite dramatic for people, particularly passengers experiencing them. There were concerns about, well, if you have people traveling on a train at speed through a tunnel, will they all be suffocated because the train pushes the air out of the way and there's no air for them to breathe? Which again, it seems ludicrous to us now, but
no, it's quite logical.
Yeah, it is, in a kind of, if you can kind of think to, well, this would have been something that people just wouldn't have experienced. So it's kind of natural that they've got these concerns and fears. Just to come back to that comment about what would have seemed fast or slow. There was concern in the 1830s and into the 1840s about the railway companies were basically private companies. They're in it to make money. They've got shareholders. They've had tremendous costs in building the lines and building all the locomotives and coaches and stock that you need to run it, and the staff and so on. So there's concern that they're out to make money, and which meant then that there was unequal access to rail transport. So the middle class is fine, upper class is fine, working class is less so in some situations. So the government stepped in and said, well, every company has to run what's called a parliamentary train, which is just one a day, but on every route that offers very cheap fares. I think a penny a mile. Which was cheaper than your other fares otherwise. So the railway companies obviously gnashed their teeth and didn't like that, and you find them doing all sorts of kind of pretty nasty dodges, putting the parliamentary train on at 2 o'clock in the morning so that they can say they've run it, but of course it's not a time when anyone wants to use it, because they want to keep the money coming in. So
some things never change.
No, well, indeed,
it's
tricky. Yeah. And those trains were very slow trains as well, because again, it discouraged people from using them.
Okay. So could you talk about the safety and the kind of the worries about the speed of the trains, but obviously working on railways was very dangerous. I know from having looked at your website. Could you tell me a little bit about the Railway Work, Life and Death project?
Yeah, sure. Actually, can I kind of just stop for a moment and say, well, actually, there's a really interesting contrast that's quite important to make, and it happens that we're talking today on the 26th of January 2021, and the reason I give the date is it's the 100th anniversary of the Abermule disaster, where two trains met head-on on a single track line. So there's an enormous collision. There's a signalling mixed up, which put the trains on the same track. They shouldn't have been able to do it. All sorts of problems that meant that they did. Big crash, and I think 17 people died, and a number were injured, 26 possibly. So we have this idea about the big passenger crashes, which are very dramatic, and when you've got newspaper reporting and so on, it's headline news, and it's a big concern in the 19th century about public safety. The difficult thing is that they're actually quite rare. They were quite rare then, they're even rarer now, fortunately. So when they happen, they're big news, and they tend to happen in spaces that people can get to, the press can get to make engravings from or take photographs of later. So they're spectacular. What you don't see much of is the staff accidents, because they kind of happen in ones and twos. They're not very spectacular, out of the way spaces. So just thinking about Abermule, so for 1921, we know that for every passenger who was killed or injured on Britain's railways, 6 workers were killed or injured. So we kind of get some sense of the proportions there, and it was much worse in the 19th century in terms of the statistics. So kind of the work is a really interesting kind of way that we can get into all sorts of different issues, particularly about class and who's deemed important, who's not, about culpability, responsibility, and so on. So there's all sorts of fascinating things to say, but the workers have been largely invisible, which is where the Railway Work, Life and Death project came about. So we're a collaboration between my institution, the University of Portsmouth, and the National Railway Museum and the Modern Records Centre at the University of Warwick. And we're working with the National Archives of the UK as well, which has been brilliant. And, the support from each of these institutions and the volunteers working on the project, and it's a huge thank you to all of the volunteers, both who've been doing transcription work, but also researching individual cases, and people who've been contributing blogs and information to us as we've been going along, because we've been finding out so much more about staff who've been involved in accidents. We came about because we knew that there was a huge body of material, accident reports, that gave us some details of certainly not all of the workers involved in accidents, but some of them that people don't really know about, and researchers couldn't really get hold of very easily. You can go to it, well, pre-COVID, you could go to the institutions to look at the records if you knew they existed, but they were never indexed. So if you're looking for a particular person or a particular location, it's a needle in the haystack job, really. Look and see what you find. Whereas what we've been trying to do is transcribe those individuals and the details that the accident reports contain, and make them available through the project website, so that people can download the details and find out more that might interest them, whether it's about family history, local history, it's academic, whether it's people in the current rail industry, whoever. Hopefully we're creating a really useful resource for people.
It is a brilliant project, and I'd really encourage anyone who's tracing their family history and finds a railway ancestor to even if you haven't found a railway ancestor yet, because I'd check your surname, because you might find that you have got a railway ancestor in between census years, for example. So yeah, I would definitely check.
Absolutely, and that's been one of the really, really heartwarming things about the project. We started off just with the National Railway Museum and their team of volunteers who, by and large, come at it from the railway side of things. They're brilliant in terms of technical knowledge. And so on, and interest and ability to kind of dig at the railway side of things. But what's been great as we've expanded is and made more and more cases available publicly. We've got about 6,500 cases at the moment, but we're working on it's about another 30,000 cases that we're working on making available, hopefully this year, across the course of the year, because we want to make sure that we've got the data clean, so it's all, we know it's sound and it's all good, and there aren't any errors in there. That we've had contacts from people who said, "Oh, I found my great grandfather in there, and here's a bit more about him," or whoever. And it's what's been wonderful is when we've had that discussion with people, and they come back and after a bit of to and fro said, "Well, really interesting story. It's a very everyday story in some respects, which I always think makes it more interesting. But would you be willing to put something together for us, a blog post for the website?" And I think in all bar one case, they said, "Oh yeah, that'd be really nice. It'd be good to make sure people know more a bit about my grandfather John or whatever." And we've come out with some really, really interesting stuff. And what's also been great, I should just kind of fly this flag again for this collaborative ideal, is that we come at this from more the kind of the railway side of things. When we've got family historians coming into it, we start to get more coming together. When we get local historians coming into it, again, we get different perspectives on the same sorts of things, and we're each used to using different sorts of sources and material. So whereas, as I say, we come with the railway accidents, but then family historians bring all of the sources, and they use quite a brilliant variety of sources as well. So coming in, bringing that in, and we get much more of the personal side of the story about the person. So it's that's been really, really interesting.
Okay, yeah, it is a brilliant project, and I love reading the blog posts. I think we all like to share our stories, really, so it's a great excuse to share your own story. So from the work that the Railway Work, Life and Death Project has done, what would you say, have you kind of come to any conclusions about what the most dangerous jobs were?
So yeah, definitely. It's what we see is, and we would expect this, the manual occupations are the most dangerous ones. They're the roles where people, and by and large it's men, are exposed to more dangers. So this would be what were known as plate layers, so the people maintaining the tracks, because they're working in and amongst moving trains more often than not. So sometimes, doesn't often happen, but sometimes you have a gang of men. There's one working together, and if a train runs into them, you have large numbers of people being killed or injured, which is tragic when it happens. Again, I'm just thinking now there's another anniversary coming up, which won't be marked in the same way that Abermule today will be marked, but another one that was in 1921, Stapleton Road, just in a Bristol suburb now, where a gang of plate layers were hit, and I think 5 were killed and 3 injured in a single go. Which won't be known because it's kind of, again, it isn't the thing that's kind of understood, known about, remembered these days. So yeah, plate layers, definitely. Goods guards, so the guards on freight trains, because they had to get out of the trains when they get to each station to uncouple or couple the wagons. And they're, again, when things are moving around them, one slip, you go underneath the wagon, and that's it, unfortunately. And I think what else would be in there, but lots of things involving goods handling. So again, it's heavy physical work, and you're in what was a very dangerous environment.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking there that I have some plate layer ancestors, so it's really interesting to know that they were, that if they weren't injured, then they were actually remarkably lucky, really. And so with all these accidents going on, when did companies start recording the accidents or even investigating them? What was the kind of attitude towards them, and how did that change?
Yeah, brilliant questions. So passenger accidents, just takes us back to passenger accidents again to kind of to highlight the difference. The government stepped in and said from 1840, right, we're going to set up a particular bit of the Board of Trade, because again these are commercial concerns, so they come under the Board of Trade governance. So we're going to set up a Railway Inspectorate to go and initially to make sure that lines are safe to open, but they very quickly take on an investigative function for passenger train crashes. So all passenger train crashes since 1840 have been investigated, again producing a huge body of reports which are very useful to us. The workers didn't fare quite so well, so their accidents, the railway companies were supposed to report those accidents to the Railway Inspectorate, but by and large didn't. So before 1870 you get some really kind of marginal statistics, where they say, oh yeah, we've had 3 deaths this year, and you think that doesn't sound convincing at all for a company of that size. Then the government basically are forced to step in and set up an investigation about accidents. So Royal Commission, when it eventually reports, there's another one that you get a report in 1877, and they say, right, companies must report accidents to workers. That improves things. It's still not complete compliance. By the time you get into the 1890s, you do have much better and much more reliable reports. A death is kind of hard not to report because it's very obvious when you've had a fatality. Injuries, they're much more marginal sometimes, because there are a large number of very small injuries. So there's some kind of debate about how many get reported, how many don't, and particularly when the regs, I think, initially say, well, you've got to be off work for 7 days before you have to report the accident. So obviously quite a lot of the small cases that were still important don't meet that criteria. So the 1890s onwards, really, you get really good government accident reports. And the railway companies, again, because railway companies are meticulous record keepers. What we've got now remaining is a fraction of the paperwork they produced. So things like staff registers, for example, there were so many of them that it wasn't possible. I mean, again, the railway companies were working organisations. They kept the registers and like the accident reports as well for as long as they were useful, and then binned them when they weren't.
Yeah.
So what we got into preservation is a very small percentage of what actually existed. But the companies start to take much better note of worker accidents from 1897, when the Workmen's Compensation Act comes in, which means that effectively, in most cases, the railway companies automatically pay compensation to workers who've been injured or their dependents if they've been killed after an accident. So that's quite useful for us as a project and as historians as a source, because it gives us a slightly different take on things.
So before that 1897 Act, where we had to be compensated, what happened if you had an accident and it affected your ability to work or to earn the same money as you were before? Yeah.
So again, this is a really interesting one. It's kind of slightly two-pronged approach, and it's basically it's down to the goodwill of the companies. Now, the companies did see themselves as paternalistic employers, so they're very much, we are the benevolent father figures, and we look after our children who are you hapless working classes, and you can't look after yourselves. I exaggerate, but only slightly. And there was a feeling that it's kind of part of the deal of working. If you were injured, the railway company would try and find you a suitable replacement job if you couldn't go back to your initial occupation. And again, for people who, goods guards say, who might lose an arm or a leg at work, that's going to make that job, which is very physical, very difficult to do. So they'd be found another role, often as something like a level crossing keeper or a ticket collector. So much less arduous, although still demanding in its own ways.
Just got this vision of all these one-armed and one-legged ticket inspectors up and down the country, because
it's really interesting because there must have been large numbers of people, just looking at the numbers, and we do have reasonable statistics on how many people were injured in what sorts of ways. There must have been large numbers of people who had lost limbs and who were found some other employment. But again, finding records and details about them, again, it's part of this issue about erasing disabled people from the past. They're not being seen. So finding that documentary record can be quite challenging. Although, again, there are some really interesting kind of elements of that, and we've had a brilliant, I should just say, it's had a brilliant guest post on the project blog about a one-armed station master. He lost his arm in a shunting accident, so moving goods wagons around in the 1860s, and he popped up in our records in the when was it, about 1911, 1912, I think, still employed, but as a station master, where he inadvertently he couldn't do the job that he was doing normally. So he had as if he had two arms. So he had a kind of a workaround that he'd set up, but it unfortunately caused another accident, a very slight one. So he suddenly appears in the records there. And what we found this kind of really brief mention about this. And we're like, well, how did he lose his arm? We didn't know. And then it was a family and local historian who had ancestors in the place where this accident had taken place, a place called Pondogor, which I probably mangle badly. It's actually just down the line from Abermule, thinking of the connections with today. And he'd done this amazing bit of research and blog post for us, basically going into, well, look, here's a detail, here's how we know when the accident happened. Here's some more information. Here's a reference that we've got to the one-armed station master here, which is this man, and here's some photographs that we found through these other sources. Absolutely tremendous. But again, the photographs, just think about visualizing, very, very concrete sense, visualizing disability. There you go. It's there. So these people must have been very common as part of the workforce, but yet we don't see them much. So again, it's kind of all sorts of interesting things that kind of sneak out of this.
Yeah, I find that really interesting as well, that he found a workaround, that he found a way of doing the same job differently because of his disability, and then that brings in a whole other type of history, doesn't it, on that kind of adaptability and what tools and techniques people used. So yeah.
Absolutely. So I should just say as well, just thinking about how workers and the dependents coped after, if it was a fatality. The other way is effectively kind of going cap in hand to the railway company and saying, listen, my husband's just been killed, please could you pay for his funeral costs? And they would write to the board of directors of particular companies. Again, it's always tragic to see it, but you do find letters in there, or it's notes, minutes in meetings. So it's not, unfortunately, the letter which would have given the detail and that kind of really direct connection, but you do see it. And typically it's just kind of a request from Mrs. X for funeral costs for her husband who was killed in a shunting accident at this location on our company, £10 granted, and that's it. That's kind of the reference. The other side, particularly for injured workers who've lost limbs, they will come and ask the company, say, well, could I have an artificial limb, please? Could you either pay for one or manufacture one in your workshops? And again, some of the railway companies, the bigger railway companies, had workshops within their railway factories that were dedicated to making artificial limbs.
Good Lord, really?
Because they obviously went through so many of them.
Wow.
So this is the kind of the thing. This was just an everyday kind of accepted part that there will be accidents, workers will be killed and injured. This isn't anything out of the ordinary. And the railway companies, sadly, were quite blasé about it, I think, and saying, so, well, it's just a risk inherent in the job, rather than perhaps thinking a bit more proactively about what can we change about this job. And again, the cynic in me says, well, one of the reasons why they don't think very actively about what can we change about the job is because it costs money. If you need to employ more people to do a job that then makes it safer, or you need to bring a new piece of machinery in, or provide some personal protective equipment, that costs money, and they're about the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean that is pretty horrifying, that it's cheaper and more cost effective to have a workshop making artificial limbs than to change your working practices. But I suppose, to put it in context, were other companies, I'm thinking the big mills where they had lots of accidents, and coal mining, were they any safer, really? I mean, by comparison.
So again, it's really interesting. There is an inquiry. By the time you get to the late 1890s, the trade unions have been gathering pace. They start in the 1870s on the railways in earnest, and the 1890s, they're really pushing the railway companies on employee safety, because we're seeing 1900, I think 16,000 workers were injured or killed in a single year, and that figure's on the rise. These are large numbers of people, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. So the railway companies are pushing them. The government says, right, we'll have an investigation, kind of the classic government response. So they set up a royal commission, and as part of that, they take evidence from workers, managers, all trades unions, all sorts, connected with the railway industry. But part of that, they do look to other industries, and they say that if you take all railway workers, then it's actually comparatively safe. But this gets back to that question about, well, which workers, which grades, which roles are more dangerous. If you took, say, shunters, so again, the people who are responsible for coupling and uncoupling goods wagons in particular, if you took their role, that was slightly less dangerous than merchant marine, so merchant shipping, or coal mining, for those occupations underground in coal mines. So it's this is one of some of these roles are some of the most dangerous roles in Britain at this time. So it's which is never a great comparison to have made, is it?
No.
This is where you don't want to be world leading.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm guessing presumably they took more of an interest in improving things when as more and more people got the vote, as more and more working class, and after 1918 when all men had the vote.
So what's interesting about this is it's kind of, there are all sorts of dynamics at play. So the period up to the First World War, the railway companies are under intense pressure, both from the growing power of the trades unions and their representatives in Parliament. So you see more working class MPs being elected, and including several railwaymen MPs. So that's really important, because then they've got a very visible political voice, albeit still not masses of power. But other bits where the railway companies kind of dodged responsibility start to decline. So they did have kind of some say in Parliament, because they had effectively friendly MPs who would kind of neuter legislation that was threatened. The railway companies weren't doing very well financially as well in the lead up to the First World War. So there was kind of real pressure on dividends and so on. So there are kind of all sorts of different directions from which, kind of economically, politically, socially, the railway companies are under pressure to do something about worker safety. So yeah, that's this is all part of the same story. So
when they did start to investigate the accidents in earnest, how would they investigate it? What kind of things would they do?
Well, you're asking all the tough questions today. So we don't know tons about the investigation process, because it's kind of one of those things that seems to have happened, but no instructions were left behind, and so on. I suspect it's one of these kind of assumed things that everyone just knows how to do it, so you just do it, and you learn from the person who's doing it before you. What we do know is that there were two types of investigation that take place. The railway companies would have their investigation, and that would often happen very quickly, within a couple of days of the accident, and I suspect would be quite cursory. Again, it's perhaps not surprising that about 90% of the time, I think they come out and say, oh, it was the employee's fault. They're doing something they shouldn't have been doing. They broke the rules, which, yes, doesn't come as a massive surprise, because then that means, of course, that the railway companies don't need to change anything if it was the employee's fault. The state inspector, so the Railway Inspectorate, would hold an investigation. Now, quite how they decided what to investigate, I don't know, because they started appointing inspectors who were dedicated to doing employee accidents in 1892, but there were only, I think, 2 to start with, and they had these kind of 10,000-15,000 worth of accidents a year to cover, so they had to make a choice about which ones to do. They only covered about 3% of all accidents, actually investigated them as time went on. So we get a tiny fraction of what was actually happening. I think they did the same sort of thing. They went to a location and asked people, looked at the physical site, asked those who were involved. What's quite interesting is occasionally you get in some of the accident reports, so these are the written up versions of these investigations. You get a reference, I couldn't interview so and so because he'd left the company's employ. So he'd either been sacked or had walked away before this investigation. By the time you get into the First World War, you get a couple where they say we couldn't talk to this person because they joined the colours, so they've gone off to fight in the war. So there's kind of all sorts of different things going on.
Do you think they did backhanders? Or just...
I don't think so, and I don't think they needed to, because again, what's interesting about this is I think the accident investigators and the railway companies thought so the state accident investigators and the railway companies thought in similar sorts of way. My impression is very much that the state's accident investigators were, some of them we don't know much about who their backgrounds, where they came from. Other than we think in the railway industry, and in some cases, I think one case we know is kind of middle management from one company. So the chances are they probably thought in the same sort of way, and that sort of way was, it's worker carelessness. Okay. And so that's kind of what they were looking for. So they didn't have, the companies didn't have to do anything truly nefarious to get the result that they wanted, because that was just natural, isn't it? That all these workers are doing these silly things because of their, they just don't understand. Okay. Rather than, what's really interesting is talking with those in the current industry. Now the presumption is that they will look at all other factors before they come to a conclusion that it was something to do with the worker. So they will say, could we have made this mode of operation more safe? Could we have, did we ask this person to work hours that were too long? What was going on, around them at the time? And so on. So the kind of all these things, and they say the very last thing they will look at is it the worker themselves, because there are so many other factors that come into play. So at least there's been a change.
You make a good point there as well there about how long had the employee, have we made them work too long? Because obviously back in sort of 1897, presumably they were doing longer hours than we are today, at very physical jobs. So
yeah, very much so. Again, what's really interesting in that contrast between the passenger-facing roles and the staff roles is that in 1892 you get an Act of Parliament, 1893 you get an Act of Parliament which limits the hours that safety critical for passenger trains or for train movements. So signalmen, and again at this point they were all signal men, that limited the number of hours they could work, because they didn't want signallers falling asleep in the signal box or being distracted because they were tired and working long shifts. Particularly when you get to the bigger locations with huge signal boxes, you've got things going on all the time, noise, distraction. So you need to be on your game with that. Otherwise, you are going to make a mistake, and people did, tragically. Again, Abermule, although a tiny place, was one example of lots going on at once and kind of slightly incredibly irregular procedures causing a problem. Whereas the staff roles where there are greater accidents, so things like the track workers, the shunters, the goods guards, and so on, you don't have that same kind of impact on passenger services. So there's not such tight regulation. So yeah, they are working 10, 12-hour days as standard. That's reduced to 10 hours, I think, in 1919. Was it 8 hours? It's been a while since I thought about that. But yeah, there's a shortening in 1919 of, I think it might be 8 hours actually, a working day. But even then you get cases where people worked excessive hours. So there's one case I'm thinking of that was on the Isle of Wight from 1915. So wartime conditions were involved, but they had a worker who'd been on duty for nearly 32 hours before he had his accident. And you think, well, it's going to happen, isn't it? If you're working that long without a proper rest.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's crazy. So how did they decide, did they kind of bear those kind of factors in mind when they compensated people? How did they decide how much compensation somebody should get?
It was, so after 1897 it was effectively a standard kind of a quota. You got X for fatality. I'm trying to think what it was now. I've got a feeling it was in the kind of about £300 mark. And then various forms of disablement. If you lost 2 limbs, it would be this much. If you lost 1 limb, this much. If you lost your sight in both eyes, this much. And there was a relatively standard kind of format there. If you're a union member, and you've been paying into particular funds, you might get a death benefit, which is a small one-off payment, or your family would. Or again, if you have been paying into the right fund, you might get some sort of kind of weekly top up from the disabled fund as well. So there are kind of other sources of financial support that might come into play, but by no means universal.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that they didn't do it on a case-by-case basis with a sort of sliding scale or anything. They just kind of went, this is what it is.
I think again, that's a product of the fact there are so many cases, and they just, if they'd done it genuinely case by case, I suspect they did, but I suspect it was a real kind of a glance at it and go, right, yeah, that one's clearly this much. Because otherwise, if we had to go through everything and really think about, well, what did this person earn? What do they need? What does their family need? Now, it would have taken forever.
Yeah, sure.
Sadly.
So we mentioned women earlier. What kind of roles were women doing on the railway? What kind of jobs were they employed in?
So again, it changes over time. You've got some from the early days, 1830s, 1840s, gatekeepers, crossing keepers. So they would open and close the gates across railway lines for either foot crossings or road crossings, for example. Again, kind of it very much looked down upon, which is again one of the reasons why, if workers were injured, they ended up with that role. It's something fitting for a disabled member of staff. You get then kind of in classic gendered roles, so serving staff in restaurants or hotel spaces, seamstresses, laundresses, and so on. Because again, the railway companies are doing all these things themselves. So if they're running hotels, if they're washing anything that's coming in and out of carriages, so antimacassars and so on, that then would be done by women. You see some changes in the First World War and Second World War where they start to, I'm not going to say open up, but women are involved in different roles. So engine cleaning, again, not driving, that's not on. And other kind of more factory-based roles as well. The National Railway Museum's got some great photographs of women workers at Doncaster railway workshops, riveting and welding and so on from the Second World War. So there's all sorts of, and in fact some nice ones from the First World War of women driving cranes at Doncaster as well. So again, these kind of heavy demanding jobs that were acceptable in wartime but less so out of wartime.
Were they safer jobs? Were there less accidents in those kind of roles?
Gut instinct says probably, because again, it's you're being exposed to less of the sorts of dangers that have serious consequences if something goes wrong. That said, there's also a question about, well, how far were women's accidents reported or recorded? I should say, carriage cleaning is another classic example of women's roles. But that one's quite interesting because you do see some fatalities taking place, because again, they're in and amongst moving trains.
Okay.
So yeah, my inclination is that I suspect that a lot of the sorts of things that happen, probably scalds or burns, for example, in laundry spaces, weren't reported or weren't investigated because it was a scald. It's, neither here nor there. Whereas obviously it could be quite dramatic, particularly in the age before penicillin, when blood poisoning, if it's a really open thing, could be fatal.
God, doesn't bear thinking about, really, does it?
No.
On a cheerier note, that's okay. What is the future for the Railway Work, Life and Death project? What's next?
So we're working on the brilliant work that volunteers are doing and getting that out to the public. We still got records at the National Archives and the Modern Records Centre, so railway company records and the trades union records that we're working on transcribing. There's plenty of them to go, probably at least another 30,000, we think. After that, yeah, great question. And I think it's what I would dearly love to do is, at the moment, we are making information available, but it's by no means complete. What we'd love to do is produce a facility. It can be done technically, it's just we don't have time or money, sadly, to do it, whereby people can send us details about accidents that happen to their family members, say, in the past. so we can learn more again about the people, about the accidents that weren't investigated as well, because this we've had lots of offers of further detailed information about cases that don't yet appear in the database because there wasn't an official investigation. So that sort of thing, kind of capturing that, and again showing how widely the railway industry both had an impact, but also how many people have railway ancestors. And again, how commonplace accidents would be absolutely fascinating. So kind of capturing that more personal side of things. It's a little way off, but I would dearly love to see that happen. I think it'd be really positive, positive way of working with other people as well.
No, me too. I've found quite a few instances. It seems like every time I open a newspaper to look for one of my own ancestors, I seem to stumble across some reporting of some accident involving a railway worker.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's. I'm not sure why it's reported in the paper necessarily when it wasn't necessarily investigated, but there does seem to be. I quite often find little snippets.
That's one of the things that would be really wonderful to do. We're talking a little bit with the British Library about this, because the newspaper collections there, about being able to bring in that sort of information, because you're right, local newspapers are absolutely a goldmine for this sort of, particularly for fatalities, and particularly where there's a report about the coroner's inquest, because those, for England and Wales, those records don't very rarely still exist. So you get not quite verbatim reports or transcriptions of the coroner's inquest proceedings, but really good ones. So you get a lot of detail, and you start to get a bit more information about not only what happened, but the people involved and the other people, the witnesses, for fatalities. But local newspapers are absolutely brilliant for that, and we'd love to be able to, again, to link the sources, to marry them up, so you get a much richer picture of what happened, the people involved, the impact that the accident had.
I had an ancestor that was a carman, and I think what he was doing is he was collecting goods from the railway on a horse and cart to take them elsewhere, and he had an accident on the cars, but that got picked up by a newspaper and reported, and it was that told me, that's what he was. I knew he was a carman, but that could be, it could be anything, and that's what then led me to realize that he was, at least some of the time working for not necessarily for the railways, but attached to that industry.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's you're right. And just to kind of, I should say that although for what we're doing, most of the people who crop up in the accident reports are railway workers, by no means all are, because lots of different people had access to the railway spaces, and some of the dangerous spaces like goods yards. Yes, you're right. Carters, timber merchants, coal merchants, all needed to go into those spaces to move goods, and they sometimes had accidents there, so they appear in the records. Sadly, we get children of either of workers or often of merchants who are messing around near the railway and end up having an accident. So we do have some surprisingly young cases coming up, and farmers needing to cross railway lines, for example, as part of their work. So there's all sorts of people that crop up in perhaps unexpected ways that we find.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I was just going back to the newspapers slightly as well when they're reporting. I think my top tip to anyone tracing their family history is always to go search newspaper records. I mean, I found a little article about my ancestor when he was aged 87 because he fell off a ladder and sprained his wrist, and it was literally 2 sentences, and they must have been having a slow news day. But you think now when you watch the news sometimes, and there'll be that little segment about extra large bunny in Berkshire has
and finally
20, and it's clearly just, it is a slow news day, and they're just padding it out. Like I guess that happened when they were writing newspapers as well.
Yeah, I love padding. Absolutely. I love local newspapers in particular, because they are, they're so good for that sort of really everyday stuff. This is the thing in some of my other work has touched on, that the wonders of the mundane, because these are so typical experiences, that actually they're more significant than, in some ways, than the big wars and the big political moments, which relatively few people are involved in determining and taking an active part in. Whereas the sorts of things that are reported in local newspapers, the railway accident happening, are affecting thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people over time. So it's thinking about these everyday things be they accidents or other, I think is really important, because we get this kind of much deeper connection with everyday life and the things that our ancestors, those before us, would have been doing, experienced, seen, and so on.
And talking of newspapers, what was the kind of public reaction, if any, to accidents? To workers getting injured in accidents.
Well, relatively small, it seems. Again, I mean, as you know, the accidents do appear in them, and particularly when you get these bigger accidents. I mentioned the Stapleton Road accident. There is press coverage of that, local and I think national, because it's so unusual and there are so many people involved. But you get your news reports. It's difficult then to get much back from it in terms of, well, do we find letters in talking about this? Sometimes you do, but not so much. Again, there's all sorts of issues there about, well, what are the editors, the editorial team selecting to print as part of the letters? So what are we actually getting? Might have been they had millions of people writing in, but it didn't fit the kind of slant or the news of the day, so they left them all out. So there are problems in terms of what we can draw from that, but it's a difficult one capturing. Oh, I should say one brilliant way of capturing what people were thinking. That actually I probably shouldn't say this because I don't want a competition on eBay, but I've gone back to eBay, which is a terrible thing. But postcards, exactly, it's the postcards. But they're absolutely brilliant. The disaster and accident postcards that were produced typically in a run-up to the First World War are a goldmine again of responses to it, because sometimes you get the a railway accident, a big railway accident pictured, and they tend to be the passenger accidents, although not exclusively. On one side, and on the other side, sometimes you get a message saying, "I walked over to see the crash site." What a terrible spectacle! So you get this kind of sense of someone's actually been there. I found a great one of someone who there's a picture of a wrecked carriage at Cromer. There's a big passenger crash there in 1905, and on the back of it they say, "I was in this carriage, very shaken, but basically unharmed." You think this is incredible, and there isn't any reason why this person should lie. It's from the time. Well, maybe there is some reason why they lie, but I'm quite happy. I'm happy enough with that one. So you kind of get these kind of really quite direct responses to it, saying, I knew the driver of this train. And sometimes you get some really quite unexpected messages on it, like one again showing, I think it was a passenger train crash. And on the back of it was, "Having a lovely time on holiday, see you soon." Because that's what I'm going to send to mark my holiday, is a disaster postcard. So this real kind of mismatch again, which I think speaks volumes to the way in which almost how commonplace accidents were in the past. That it's another accident. Oh well, but I've got other things like my holiday to be telling you about. So there's kind of really interesting kind of things that we get from the postcard. So much as I hate to say it, I'd definitely say look at postcards for responses to, again, everyday events.
I think that's a brilliant tip. Do you find do you get any instances of sort of colleagues of the worker kind of striking or anything like that, sort of refusing to work or work in the same way until something's resolved, or is that quite rare?
I can't think of it. I have looked for that, and I'd expect to see a stronger response in the trades union records. They generally, again, it's a bit tricky. Trade unions are in a bit of a bind on how to deal with this. Believe it or not, they were not massively keen on striking, and the railway trade unions were some of the strongest at the turn of the 19th into 20th century. But they weren't massively keen on it, partly because they kind of this idea about demonstrating respectable trade unionism and working within the system. So strike was really something of a last resort, and they'd much rather negotiate and bargain to get better working conditions. So I haven't found any instances. I can't think of any instances where something particularly unsafe has happened and there has been a strike as a result of it.
I find that really interesting in itself, because I had kind of in my ignorance presumed that people did kind of strike a little bit more often, or almost mini strikes.
Well, I think that's probably it. Again, it's we got to think about the kind of political circumstances of the time, and in from 1905, I think, with the Taff Vale judgment, which is again about how trade unions can, there's two cases, Taff Vale and Osborne judgments, about how the trade union can both strike and also take political subscriptions and money from their members. The leanings of the government at the time, albeit still liberal, but were kind of conservatively inclined, conservative with a small c, as we'd understand it, meant that they're quite restrictive about how unions could take strike actions. And you don't want to be taking kind of effectively illegal strike action, because that brings all sorts of problems. So it's, as I say, kind of last resort, really serious issues, and doing things on a local basis. You do have wildcat strikes, but I think they're almost, these safety issues are almost so local that they're going to affect an individual engine shed or goods yard or something like that. So it's kind of, there aren't enough people to make a strike actually happen in those particular circumstances.
Yeah, and presumably if it's only 2 or 3 workers refusing to work, they're quite easily replaced, aren't they? So it has less impact. Okay, so last question then. Give you a break because you've worked so hard. If I was to find a railway ancestor, or if you were to find a railway ancestor, what would be the first thing you'd do to go and find out more about them, or what their life was like?
Ooh, I would. That's a tough one. I think I'd start with the National Railway Museum, because I think with again, particularly at the moment with the online content, there's such a breadth of material there, visual, oral histories as well, that even if you would probably be unlikely to find something that relates directly to your ancestor, but you will find something that tells you a bit about the role that they were doing, and you can learn a lot about the kind of the general duties and the sorts of circumstances that they would have worked in through that. So the National Railway Museum is a great starting point, and also it's got links then on to other sources of information, including the Railway Work, Life and Death Project.
Brilliant. Well, Mike, thank you ever so much for your time. I think you've given us some absolutely brilliant tips and advice, and I urge everyone to go and check out the Railway Work, Life and Death Project. Thanks,
Natalie. It's been really fun.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit subscribe or visit me at www.genealogystories.co.uk.